Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're having a look at some of the stuff which was passed to the developers in October 2019. Now I understand that I haven't finished all of the stuff from September. I'm going to make sure to cover that stuff in the next few days. I am technically around 8 or 9 videos behind where I want to be when it comes to War Thunder content, so over the next few days, if you see some content which is more designed for maybe about a month ago, then you might understand why. Unfortunately, I've been hit with a bit of illness, and also with the amount of content that War Thunder is pumping out right now, it is at a point where keeping on top of it is not exactly easy to do. So, let's get started with this. We're going to do the ground forces part of the past to developers stuff in October 2019 first, just to try and change it up a little bit. So thank you as always to Coke Spray for putting this together, and also thank you to everyone who creates these articles which are passed on to the developers. The first one is from Mk.I, and it's talking about the M6E1. Now the M6E1 was a way to try and modernize the M6. As you all know, we have the M6 in game, the one which is powered with the 76mm and also the 37. And the project never really got off the ground when it comes to main production for many different reasons, but also at the same time, they did test a bunch of different ideas on the chassis, and the M6E1 is one of those. They added a T26 turret to it, which of course has the 90mm on it. Now there is some interesting conflicting reports, and Mk.I actually goes through this, because according to a report on the 10th of April 1944, the M6 was cancelled by verbal order of the 7th of March 1944 from Chief Development Branch. Now, we're talking about the M6 which had the T26 turret on it, as you can see here. It was, according to this, never fully built. It was just, the drawings were completed and they were just filed. But if you actually look at Colonel Robert J. Hicks, he stated that such a tank was actually tested. So while they cancelled the program, it seems the pilots may have squeaked by and been finished. It was even given a designation, which you can see here, the M6E1 heavy tank in 1944, M6 with a 90mm and turret of a T26 tank. So it just seems kind of odd that it's been given a designation, even though even though it was cancelled at the drawing stage, and also you have reports of it actually being built. So it'll be interesting to see if there are any pictures of this thing, but at least from my general research I haven't found anything. But yeah, it's generally just an M6 tank, or the M6 chassis, with a T26 turret with the 90mm mounted to it. It would be an interesting premium if it existed, because obviously we don't want to put paper designs in the game. The next vehicle is from Results 45, and it's talking about the fat-bottomed Panzer IV. This is, of course, the Panzer IV aus GH mit hydrostatischem Antrieb. I'm sure I've completely screwed that up. But basically, what you're seeing here is a Panzer IV which was recovered from the battlefield, and they added a petrol-electric drive from it, which is famous from the Porsche Tiger 1 prototype and also the Ferdinand tank destroyer. Now, of course, it doesn't have the best reputation, because obviously when the Ferdinand was put onto the battlefield in Kursk, let's just say it had a few issues when it came to engine fires, and it definitely came down mainly to this petrol-electric drive. Luckily, on the Panzer IV, which underwent this heavy alteration, it was done in 1944. So therefore, after a lot of the issues that the Germans ran into, and also it was on much less of a heavier system and had a lot less stress on it. So therefore, they added into it in 1944. The engine compartment was completely rebuilt. It housed the drive under a large sloping engine deck, and behind the drive there were 2 supporting oil pumps which were installed and connected directly to an unmodified Maybach HL120 TRM engine powering 2 hydraulic motors. So the reason why it is an interesting vehicle to add is because it would pretty much have the same capabilities as a Panzer IV, but also is different and still exists to this day. This is actually in America right now. In 2015, it was relocated after being at Aberdeen Proving Grounds for since 1946. It is now in Alabama at the Military History Storage Facility in Anniston. So it's one of those vehicles which is still about and would be a lovely premium to add because it existed, it was tested. The only problem is the testing on the German side of things very much doesn't really exist anymore, but at least on the American side of things, they tested it thoroughly after the war. The next one is a Hellspawn. This is from Alpha Noodle, and this is talking about the PT-76, the PT-76E, sorry. So this was the last or most modern modification of the PT-76, and they decided it was a great idea to take a gun from the the ZSU-57 and add it to the PT chassis. So, you know the ZSU-57-2, the one that we have in the game? That is the gun that you find on this chassis. Apart from, it's better. The reason why it's better is because it has a two-plane stabilizer on it. So imagine a PT-76 running around with this gun of the ZSU-57, which had a two-plane stabilizer as well. So it would just be whapping about the place with the 57, which could fire 120 rounds per minute. It has a auto-loading system which can house 20 shells, and then it has 73-round carousel ammunition below that. So you have a 20-round clip before you have to relax, and then you have to reload with the 73-round ammunition carousel, which you can see down here. You can see it's below the two guys in the turrets. It's an incredibly cramped turret as well. I kind of feel bad for them here, but then again, you'll have to listen to a gun firing at one round every half a second. That's probably going to send you deaf. The gun had 5 degrees of gun depression and also 30 degrees of gun elevation, the muzzle velocity being about 1,000 meters per second, and it was also designed to fire APT and also HEF, so fragmentation trace around, so hefty, and then APT as well, the same one as the upgraded round that you find on the ZSU-57. This to me just seems like a Hellspawn, especially when I remember the ZSU-57 being added to the game, and it just annihilated tanks as it fought. Being a Leopard driver at that time was definitely not the funnest thing to be. It of course still has the same armor as the other PTs, 13mm hull front, incredibly sloped, and 3 men, 2 in the turret and of course the driver. Overall, if this got added to the game, at least it would be interesting. I'd worry about its balance though, just because it would be completely balanced around that stabilized 57mm. It would either be too powerful or not powerful enough, and that is a real issue with a gun like that. The next vehicle is from Cade, and it's talking about a vehicle that I would have loved to see, in the game, and wish it was in the game a lot earlier. This is the DECCAN, or the Mark I DECCAN as it's known, the A.E.C. Mark I DECCAN. You can see it right here. You basically take a truck, the Matador truck chassis, you add a bunch of armor to it, you add a little bit of a 6-pounder on the back, put a nice little area around it to protect the gunner and the loader, and start brapping people. The overall idea of the DECCAN was that the British needed a mobile tank destroyer / artillery piece in North Africa. The reason for this is because they just wanted something that would be incredibly mobile, which would be able to support the troops in some form of artillery or tank destroyer way, and because of North Africa, you had a situation where trucks had the same mobility as tanks. So, and if you can make trucks, you know, it's cheaper to make them, and you can also house a 6-pounder on it, why not build a bunch of them to, which would be much easier to make than tanks, to get on the front of the battlefield and go after the enemy. So that's basically what they did with the DECCAN. They took as I said, a generic Matador truck chassis, added a bunch of armor to it, added a gun to it, and off you go. The DECCAN, though, even though they created 175 of them, they were used predominantly in 1942 and also 1943, but once North Africa ended, the DECCAN was basically no more, because you've got to remember in 1944, the invasion of Normandy happened, and the DECCAN was just seen as pretty much useless by the time the Allies had invaded France. There was no real use for it because, well, they weren't in the same conditions as North Africa. There was no mobility issues when it came to the vehicles, and also they were just much larger tanks by then, and much larger, better tank destroyers. So therefore, the DECCAN just kind of fell out of fashion, wasn't really used, but I still think it should be in the game just because it has this wonderful chassis, this wonderful 6-pounder gun, which you see on the, you see on one of the Cromwells and also other vehicles. The 6-pounder is the 57mm, by the way. It also had access to a 95 horsepower engine just to power you about the place. For me, it is a through and through British vehicle, which should definitely be in the game. The next vehicle is from A.E.C, and it's talking about the Type 93 close-range surface-to-air missile. So one of the things that we've seen an explosion of over the last year in War Thunder is stuff like the Tunguska, the A.E.C, of course the Roland twins from France and Germany, the Stormer as well from the British. One of the only nations that doesn't have some sort of SAM system is the Japanese. And the reason for this is because there isn't really a comparable version of anything which is similar to something like an A.E.C or a Tunguska. But if you compare it to something like a Stormer, there is a few options around, and this is one of them. The Type 93 close-range surface-to-air missile. It's pretty much as simple as this. You take a HMV, which is a high-mobility vehicle. In this time, this one was actually built by Toyota, and you pretty much just strap a SAM system to it, which is able to fire 8 missiles at the enemy. These are SAM-2 missile launchers, and they equip the Type 91 man-portable surface-to-air missile, which is also known as the SAM-2. So that's pretty much it when it comes to this HMV, the Type 93. It's just you take a truck, which you see here, and you strap a bunch of missiles to it and aim them at aircraft. Now, the only issue with this idea, which is why I haven't really thought it would be that useful in the game, especially nowadays when stuff like the Ka-50 exists. The problem is the max range of these SAM-2 missiles is only 5 kilometers. So the Ka-50 can shoot over 10, they can shoot up to 10 kilometers, and a lot of top-tier vehicles can outrange the Type 93. There's also the issue that this would be completely useless against ground vehicles, but then again, the Stormer exists, the Roland exists, and so does the Flarak. So I don't see that too much of an argument, as long as this will be a hard counter to aircraft, and also stuff such as the Ka-50, but it just won't be, because of the range issue. Overall, it would be nice to see it in game. It is heavily used by the Japanese and their self-defense force, so why not just chuck it in? At the end of the day, if it is useless, at least it will become a fun vehicle that you can dick about in stuff like custom battles, or maybe capture points as another option for the Japanese. And it's definitely true that the Japanese need some form of top-tier AA when it comes to trying to rebalance, the issues that they have compared to other nations at top tier. The next vehicle is a captured T-34. This is from 1MAX 9000, and it's talking about a T-34 Mod 41, which was captured by the Italians when they invaded southern Russia. Now, everything that I've read about the southern Russian campaign from the Italians was incredibly negative on the Italian side of things. They basically turned up, realized that their armor was pretty much useless against what they were facing, and got battered a little bit. But if you, I suppose, want a little bit of history into the game, which would try and show, the Italians in a positive light when it came to the southern Russian offensive, this would be part of it. They did capture a few vehicles. This was one of them. And the captured T-34, being a mod 1941, means that it has the F-34 cannon on it, the 76mm, and I think this would just be exactly the same as the ones that you find in the Soviet tech tree. I don't think there's any difference between it. The Italians actually use this as a command vehicle, of all things, which is kind of interesting, and it was used in the 62nd Division of the 120th Artillery Regiment, and also there is a documentary called the L'Armata Italiana in Russia, or the Italian Army in Russia, which you can watch as well if you want more information. But just from a game point of view, it would just be a captured vehicle in the Italian tech tree. I know a lot of people are against captured vehicles. I myself am very much against the idea of captured vehicles, just because I like nations to be, independent and feel different to other ones. But if I suppose you want to bolster the mid-ranks of Italy, which definitely need it, this would be a nice pick for that idea. The next one is a captured vehicle as well, but has a really interesting story behind it. So Wise Minerva is bringing us the story of the Tiger I tank, which is called Bretagne, or Bretagne, that was used by the FFI. Now, the FFI in World War II was the name used for late war French resistance fighters. It was called the French Forces of the Interior, so resistance fighters of France the end of World War II. And what they decided to do, since, they were volunteers and they wanted to aid in the war efforts, is they came together and realized that after the invasion of Normandy, there was just a bunch of littered, abandoned tanks just left by the Germans around that area in, South Normandy and areas like that. So between January and March of 1945, they pretty much just gathered together all of these vehicles and used them in a weird and wonderful pseudo kind of tank battalion in a way. They were able to gather up one Tiger I, one Tiger II, a Panther, 11 Panzer IV tanks, a Panzerwerfer 42, 2 tank trailers, including a crane, 1 workshop truck, and 4 trucks with 4 pickups of spare parts. So they created this little tank battalion of captured vehicles and used them all the way throughout the war. And the reason why the Tiger I is the one which is being focused on right now is because the Tiger I still exists in a museum that you can see here, and it's actually on display at the Musée de Blind, which you can find, I believe, in France. It was repainted with its German colors, but the reason why this one would be slightly different to the Tigers we already have is the fact that it doesn't have any side skirts, as you can see, and we'll get into why in a second. And the other thing as well is it has this massive dent in the front of it. And the reason why it has this massive dent is because the dent was created because the tank accidentally collided with Martin Schroeff's Tiger. So when the two Tigers hit, they couldn't disengage, and the 102nd SS Heavy Tank Regiment ended up abandoning their tanks. So the reason why that exists is because of that. So it would just be a nice little thing to add into the game with this little physical mark, just to make it different to the German one. And on top of this as well, what it does is it starts a conversation between people. So people start going, why does this dent exist? Then you get a cool little historical tidbit in the game on top of it. So the other thing as well is the reason why the side skirts don't exist on this vehicle is because they were used, it seems, to be used as a makeshift bridge for getting across this little river. So somebody stripped the side skirts in order to use them as a bridge, which is just insane to me that that exists. But you can see here there's a bunch of different pictures of course, the FFI with their tanks. And since we already have, a captured well, not a captured Panther tank, but a Panther tank that was used post-World War II by the French, why not add in a captured World War II Tiger, which was used by the FFI in World War II all the way until the end of the war, even into 1946. The last vehicle on the list is a big hunker-junker, which is something that a lot of people have asked for over the years, and it is by Overlord. This is the SO-122, and simply imagine taking a Sherman tank and adding a 122mm to it. That's basically what you're seeing here. The Balkans in World War II is a place that doesn't get too much coverage when it comes to games or when it comes to history, but there was, of course, intense fighting and intense combat in World War II there between the Yugoslav partisans and the Axis powers, and of course the people who supported them. Now, there was a lad called Tito, and he gained enough power and prestige to be recognized as the true leader of the Yugoslav resistance, and to try and go away from the Soviet influence of the area, what he wanted to do is use different vehicles and kind of fight back against what he deemed as the oppressors. So what he did was he basically called on the Americans to help, and he got stuff such as the M4A3E4. These were originally fitted with 75mm, which you can see here, and then they were retrofitted with 76mm later on, but they weren't content in just keeping it there. So even though the Yugoslavians had M4s which looked like Fireflies because of the 76mm, the only difference is they didn't have the metal basket on the back, which you see from, of course, the British Sherman Firefly. They still had, some interesting Shermans, but they didn't want to stop. They wanted to keep trying to modify these vehicles to bring them into the modern day. So the first thing that they did is they took a bunch of Shermans and tried to upgrade them with the T-34's V2 diesel engine. This was because the diesel engine gave the vehicle a little bit more power, and also, I'm guessing, when it comes to the supply lines, maybe it helped them in that way as well. They were able to set up 5 of these vehicles with the V2 diesel engines on top of being able to, upgun them to 76mm, and they stopped the program just because it was a lot of effort and time to replace the engines for not too much of a benefit, even though there was a slight benefit there. So they moved on to the next program in 1961, which was, of course, the 122mm mounted Sherman, which you can see here, the SO-122. What they wanted to do was to just replace the Sherman gun with an A19 122mm cannon. This is the same gun that you see on the IS series of tanks, which is labeled the D25T, and it was seen as an infantry supporting SPG instead of a tank destroyer. The main issue, though, with the 122 was that the gun depression was only 2 degrees, I believe, and then it only had 10 degrees of gun elevation. So using it in some form of artillery or howitzer role was never really going to work because of the fact that it was very limited when it comes to its elevation and also its depression. The vehicle, though, they took out the coaxial machine gun, they took out the hull-mounted machine gun and the machine gunner's position. They were able to fit around about 30 shells in this, and they actually saw it as kind of a success. 96 of these vehicles were planned, but the project was cancelled alongside the M634, the M634, of course, being the Shermans with the upgraded V2 engines, because of the fact that they just wanted to use other variants such as the M36, the M36B1, stuff like that. It would have just been much easier to do instead of create basically a whole new turret front for a Sherman to house the 122mm. There was also another SO-122 project where they took off the Sherman's turrets and were supposed to mount the 122mm howitzer that you find as the M38. So this is, of course, the A19, but the M38 is the gun that you find on stuff, I believe, like the Su-122. So it'll be a lot more different different to what you see here. The project just really never got off the ground just because of the fact that, they just found a better option. But in War Thunder, obviously, it would be a nice vehicle to see, because the 122 is always fun when it pens and do a ton of damage, and it's another Sherman variant, which would add to the insane list of Sherman variants we already have in the game. So those are all the vehicles when it comes to ground that were passed onto the developers in October 2019. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Daniel Stanton, Jay Wilt, John Ryman, Joseph Anders, Martinez, Moxie, Super Cacti, Uyens Terry, Elove Goat, and Seductive Trashcan for supporting the channel.